By way of introduction, my name's Chris Jackson. I'm a reliability engineer and I help Fred out with some of his Ascendo stuff. Also, primarily help a lot of companies trying to solve problems that include not just reliability engineering, but specifically reliability allocation, which is what I'll be talking about today. And reliability allocation is one of the more, I suppose, crucial parts of some reliability programs, but it can, to an extent, be overdone. And so today I'm going to be talking about 3 ways of allocating reliability, and we'll go into what reliability allocation means shortly. But I'll focus on 3 ways, but not before I contextualize and talk about the steps that reliability allocation must be embedded within. So let's just say we start with a product or a medical device in this example. But more correctly, we haven't got this device designed yet. We actually only have a concept, a vision, or a need for such a device. And at best, we can say this is what our device looks like in our heads. And let's just say that we have some concept about what the reliability of this device should be. That's all well and good, and that might give us a sense of accomplishment without having to do anything else. But the problem then comes when we realize that this device is actually made up of a number of different parts and components. And so if we line them all up, we'll see that this one over here is going to be provided by a third-party vendor. This one here is brand new technology. This one here is the same component as the last model, and this one here is going to be designed by an independent design team. So having a system reliability goal is of itself not entirely useful when you have all these different teams and components being built and designed in potentially different countries. So what are the reliability goals for each one of these components? Let's just say that for example, that the reliability goal for our product is 95%. And let's just say that after that, we then simply allocate that same reliability goal to each one of these 9 components. Well, if you do the modeling, you realize that the system reliability turns out to be 63%. So you can't simply allocate a system level goal to subsystems or components. You will be sadly disappointed. And the process of working out what each one of these goals should be is reliability allocation. Now, reliability allocation, more formally, is assigning of numerical reliability goals to subsystems and components in support of system performance characteristics. Now, this most importantly allows your smaller design teams to independently work on key elements of the overall product or system. You typically have electrical engineers working in their particular area to design and build the electrical part of your product. You have mechanical engineers doing something else. You have hydraulic engineers doing something else. You'll have chemical engineers designing reagents and things like that. So we just have to acknowledge that this is the reality. These teams will be working quasi-independently, and they need their own goals. And it also helps us allocate money to meet these reliability goals. Each component will have its own unique challenges. Some components will find it easier to have higher reliability performance levels than others. So as a design team lead, reliability allocation helps you understand where you need to throw your limited money. It also informs the overall process as it relates to reliability. We're going to talk very soon about how designing for reliability, or the reliability cycle, is iterative. This is just the first step, having an initial estimate. And it also allows trade-offs and other design elements to be investigated in a very feasible way. What does weight look like? Are you going to choose between a battery which is rechargeable, which needs its own charger, and that might be more reliable, or do you need to have, or does a device need to have, because of space requirements, disposable batteries, which can be less reliable? Well, if you don't allocate reliability and closely manage reliability, then you will essentially be guessing which trade-off you need to look at. So I know we've only just started talking about it, but I'll open up the floor to any questions so far. I haven't seen too much in the chat windows about what reliability allocation means to you, but if any people have their own thoughts on what reliability allocation means beyond what I've just said, I would be glad to hear them now. So I'll just take a couple of seconds to listen to any feedback, any input to that question. Can see some typing action. Not a lot, or maybe it was a ghost typer. Well, it looks like we don't have too many questions coming in so far, so that means to me, or I'll assume that my description of what reliability allocation is and what it should do is satisfies what you think or what your preconceived ideas of what reliability allocation was. So let's move on to our design process, this beautiful little diagram where we go from concept on the left through to disposal on the right. But we as engineers, we all know that this diagram is way too pretty. It's never like this. So let's be a little bit more realistic. Our design process is a bit more back of the beer coaster. It has a little bit of, while we do adhere to overarching and high level phases, it can be quite a tailored, quite a custom, quite an ad hoc process in some cases. Now, if we look at the design part of our design process, in practice, we actually have quite a few goes at getting a design ready to go before we think about building it. And even then, we'll have quite a few prototypes which may or may not hit the mark. So we need to go back to our design phase or go back to redesigning the product or system to improve the overall reliability. And these two different elements are called what we call analytical and prototypical design phases. And at all stages, we are verifying as well. But it obviously gets a lot more complicated than this. And we have all these different elements which are about to just come up right now, influence our design process. And we're not going to go into each one of these now, but suffice to say, our design process, our design sequence, it involves several inputs, it involves several criteria. Things like prototyping need to be considered. We need to understand constraints and criteria as they relate to the business plan, and perhaps most importantly, at the start of our design phase, we need to have a design plan. But let's not forget, we need to have manufacturing considered as well. So we need to design for manufacturability. We need to think about tooling as well, so on and so forth. So the design process is not nearly as clinical and neat as some textbooks would like us to think. So if we look at the design and build phase in greater detail, they're not really that sequential. There's this cycle, which we can see on the screen now, that typically you typically see in most good reliability design processes, and as overseen by good team leaders. We start with allocating reliability goals. We then do smart design. We update our system model. We then focus on the vital few. We'll likely only have a couple of failure mechanisms that matter way more than others. And so not only do we want to learn what these are, we want to learn what the trivial thousands are as well, so we don't worry about them to the same extent. We then simulate, analyze, and test until failure. We re-estimate system reliability, work out if we're finished. Almost certainly won't be finished after our first design iteration. And after we realize we need to do more, then we need to do something about it. If we haven't met our reliability goals, we go back to the start of our system with a new approach or an updated approach with additional resources, so on and so forth. And instead of looking at this as a very simple cycle, this is actually how we grow reliability. We work out what the weak points of our system are and do something about it. And as each time we go through this cycle, reliability continues to grow. And I do want to say one thing about simulating, analyzing, and testing until failure. We are not just talking about testing. We are talking about things like analysis, things like finite elements modeling, so on and so forth. But if you do test, you should be focusing on those vital few failure mechanisms that matter. And you should know this from your modeling your system reliability at all stages. Why I emphasize this is because we need to include an analysis, non-testing analysis into reliability allocation in a way we'll talk about very shortly. So I'll open the floor again to any questions. Are there any questions about this relatively simplistic but hopefully somewhat universal general approach to designing reliable products. Can't see too much typing activity, so I'll assume again, hopefully, that what I've described so far is resonating with all of you. Okay, so let's go back to our little reliability design cycle, put it back in our overall process, and start talking about reliability allocation. Well, I'm going to talk about 6 steps. The first step for reliability allocation is identifying customer requirements. The second step is establishing system reliability goals, which are different in many cases to the customer requirements. The third step is incorporate a reliability design margin. The fourth step is what we call establishing preliminary functional series design. The fifth step is allocating reliability. And the sixth step is leading and doing something with all the information we gather along the way. So let's start with an example. Step 1, customer requirements. We go through the full and thoughtful process of specifying customer reliability requirements. So in this case, let's just say this medical device needs to have a reliability of no less than 95% after a 3-year service life when used in accordance with specified use cases. And you can see we have 4 parts of our reliability definition here. Now this is completely made up. It's not based on any device I'm aware of. But let's just say that our marketing team, our technical experts, our leadership in our organisation has perhaps correctly identified that this is what customers are expecting. So this becomes our customer requirement. And so if we say this is what, so let's just say on this graph, this is what we believe the customer wants. But this doesn't mean that our product can afford to be this unreliable. There's a reason for this, because in some cases we need to do things like reliability demonstration testing, where we actually need to design something which is more reliable than the requirement to have a reasonable chance of passing. And we incorporate this little band of additional reliability you can see here over on the left, based on what we call a discrimination ratio, which is a subject of another demonstration testing conversation. There's also we also need to take into consideration that our device will not be used in laboratory conditions. Our users are going to find new and different novel ways of using our device. So there typically is always a decrease in apparent reliability when our product, which has only ever existed in a clean lab, gets used by the user for the first time. And so we need to accommodate that. So the next thing we might do is increase our system reliability goal to exceed our customer requirement to accommodate testing and actual use cases. But we still have nothing to play with. And what do I mean by that? If we look at our system reliability goal over here, that's what we have to achieve. But we might want a little bit more reliability. You can see in this little band on the left here, so that our reliability team lead has something to play with when they're going through when they're on the journey of designing for reliability. So we call this reliability design margin. And in this case, let's just say it's a third of the unreliability we have left in our specification. Now, I'm using some example fractions, example ratios. You just need to you need to choose what works for you. And if your system is very developmental, you might want to have more margin than I have here. Or if your system is well understood, if it's just simply an update to existing technology, then you might not need quite as much margin because you're very confident of how the system will perform. So, our reliability requirement now includes reliability design margin. So what we started off with 95%, we went to a system reliability goal of 96.7%, and we went up to our final requirement, which includes design margin of 97.8%. And these, I must confess, are strictly example figures. That I'm not advocating for certain fractions or requirements. It's up to you to research what makes sense for you. And we always need to understand that when we're designing something, regardless of how mature we think it is, there's always inherent uncertainty, which is why we need to have these buffers. Okay, so here's our system with all these different parts. We then typically create what we call a basic functional series system. And here's a basic fault tree, which shows the 9 components of our system are arranged in a series model. That is, if any one of these elements fails, the entire system fails. And there's a reason why we do this. We don't want to unnecessarily impose redundancy just yet. So we create our preliminary functional series design, which is a reasonable first assumption when you're thinking about designing, allocating reliability. The next step is to allocate. Step 5, allocating reliability, and we use this equation here. So starting on the left-hand side, this is our allocated design goal for the ith component module or subsystem. Over here are what we call our allocation factors, and I'll talk about what these allocation factors are very shortly. Here is our system design goal, which in this case was 97.8%. So when we want to work out what the allocated goal for each component or subsystem is, we use our allocation factors, put it into this equation, which includes our reliability design goal for the system, and we get an answer. And we'll go through an example very shortly, because I want to emphasize that this is simply the first effort of a bigger design process. So here is our cycle we talked about earlier, where we're growing reliability over here. We use these goals to work out if our system is not on track. So if we have allocated all these goals, all these different performance levels to our teams and subsystems, we can then work out, as we continually analyze our system, if something isn't on track. And if something is not on track, we can then do something about it. So the main point of our next step is always deciding to do something. Now, there are a few options that you can pursue when you're deciding to do something if one of your components is not meeting an allocated reliability goal. The first thing is you can reallocate reliability from a component, subsystem, or module that is doing well. So if you have one team which is really struggling to meet its allocated reliability goal, but another team is doing very, very well, exceeding expectations, then you can simply, or in a way, take some of the allocated reliability from one and give it to the other. And if you do this in a controlled way, your team leader will always be certain that you're on track to meet system reliability performance. The design team lead can also decide to allocate reliability from the design margin. Why do you include design margin? Why don't you just give them as easier goals to aspire to from the start? Well, one of the reasons you might do this, to keep that design margin up your sleeve, is to make sure people are striving to explore the upper reaches of feasible reliability. If you have lower goals and teams aren't trying quite as hard, then when you struggles, all the other teams haven't already invested or designed reliability into their respective components to allow you to use their reliability in a tailored way. Another thing you can do is invest more time and money into your struggling component, subsystem, or module. One option I've also seen is where we outsource that component, subsystem, or module to an expert supplier, a third party that knows what they're talking about or knows that particular technology very, very well. And there's also the other thing you can do, if you're not going to do that, is include redundancy. So the reason why we start with a series system typically, and then go through the process of allocating reliability before we worry about redundancy, is we don't want to take flexibility away from the design team. We want to only incorporate redundancy if that's the most cost-effective way of meeting our reliability goals. And if you can't do any of these, then you need to go back to the business case or the business team within your organization and let them know that that the requirement that we thought we could achieve is simply not feasible. And this might sound like admitting defeat, but actually, if you have genuinely realized you can't meet reliability goals through a very structured approach like this, then understanding the limitations of your product or system and having it influence your business plan from the start is immensely useful. It's better knowing this now than halfway through a warranty period. So I'll jump to questions so far. I can see that, having flicked back, I can see there's a bit of commentary going on over here. I've seen Michael talking about Six Sigma, and Six Sigma. And I'm understanding, Michael, you're talking primarily about manufacturing constraints and things like that. I'm not entirely sure of the background, and I must confess that reliability allocation tends to stay within the design space in most organisations, but there's no reason it has to. A lot of the developmental technologies and developmental products, your designers and manufacturers work hand in hand because they're having to develop new technologies. But Six Sigma is certainly one way that you can minimize variability, which means that you don't necessarily need to have quite as much design margin. And Hojat, I see that you asked about considering confidence levels during this process. Is there a way that confidence levels can be allocated? Well, one way, and I see Fred talking about the goal with respect to populations. But Hojat, you might recall we included a margin, not a margin, but we included a difference between our customer requirement and system reliability goal to accommodate the uncertainty in demonstration testing. For example, I talked about discrimination ratios. Typically, we would have a certain confidence level, and to be able to meet to be able to pass our tests, we often need to have a reliability performance level that exceeds the goal for that very reason, to incorporate confidence, the required confidence. So that's an entirely separate conversation as well. But we do incorporate uncertainties in every step of the way. In a very formal way, we do that with our system reliability goal when it's based on demonstration test planning. John, do you have any guidance, rules, or thumb in determining the reliability target margins? I can see that Fred has said that's a subject of another webinar, and I would agree with Fred in that case as well. But typically we want to have bigger margins for more developmental systems. I have seen some design teams have a 50% design margin, a reliability design margin, and that was for a relatively robust device as well. So these design margins can be quite high. It really depends on the circumstance, depends on the maturity of the technology, so on and so forth. So some really good questions there. I can see that people are really understanding some of the things we're talking about, which is inspiring this really good dialogue. So those are fantastic questions, and I'd ask them to keep coming. We'll pause throughout the webinar to come back and answer any ones that I miss that pop up during my conversation. Okay, so let's go back and talk about what those allocation factors are. We might remember step 5, we had that equation which had allocation factors, which we plugged into that horrific equation to spit out subsystem module component reliability goals. So let's go back to our product or device. We know that it has this particular goal over here, in this case 97.8%, because it includes a system reliability goal that takes into consideration uncertainty and design margin. We have 9 components. And if we put them all over here, you'll recall that some are going to be provided by a third-party vendor, some represent new technologies, some are the same component as last model, and some are designed by independent design teams. And we need to work out what these reliability goals are. This is the problem. So what we can do, for example, is look at, let's say, the most complex component, the one which has the most intricate design characteristics. And let's just say that we're going to give this component an allocation factor of 10. 10 is the highest allocation factor we can give in this particular scale. And then what we do is for all other components, we compare them in complexity to our most complex component and give them allocation factors. And you can see here that, for example, an allocation factor of 8 means that we think this component is 80% as complex as our most complex component. So we plug these into our equation we talked about earlier. There's our system reliability design goal. Here's our allocation factor for a particular subsystem. The sum of all allocation factors goes up here, which in the example we just looked at is 49. And this will be our design goal for that particular subsystem and components. So here we go. We plug in 49 there. We plug in our reliability goal of 97.8%, divide it by 10, because in this case, we're looking for the goal of our most complex component. And here is our reliability design goal of 99.55%. Now let's look at the least complex component, which has an allocation factor of 3. We plug 3 into the equation, and the goal turns out to be 99.86%. And so if we compare the two, we can see that the most complex component has the easier reliability goal to achieve. 99.55 is less than 99.86. And just be aware that you need to be comfortable with high subsystem and component reliability goals. I see that also a question has come Cristomo about how repairable systems approach can help allocation. One approach is to look at hazard rates, and as opposed to allocating reliability goals, you allocate hazard rate goals as well. That's outside the scope of this webinar, but it's a really good question. And perhaps in hindsight, I could have added a couple of equations at the end which show how you convert reliability to hazard rate if you're concerned about repairable systems, particularly if you're in the space of asset and plant management. But that's a very good question, Cristomo. So after this, we have gone through all our allocations. We've given our components allocation factors, and when we plug those allocation factors into our equation, we see that our most complex subsystems have the easier reliability goals to achieve. Now, I'll throw the floor open to any questions on allocation factors, what they mean in practice, and understanding that we're about to go into a more detailed review or detailed conversation about how we get these allocation factors. I also see a question from Pascal. Could you link the complexity of a subsystem to could you link parts count for each subsystem factor? In some cases you can, Pascal, especially for electrical componentry. There's an approach which is called the agree approach. We're going to cover that in a very short period of time, which is based on essentially a group of experts who are primarily involved in radios and electronic componentry, and they simply looked at not necessarily the number of components, but the number of modules within each PCB. Okay, so moving on to the next question. So what are the 3 ways I could to do reliability allocation we're going to talk about today? Well, number 1 is based on complexity, and we've actually just covered that approach where we allocated gave an allocation factor of 10 to the most complex subsystem or component, and then scaled every other component in a relative way. Number 2 is based on complexity and risk, and I see a question from John where he presumes the magnitude of the allocation factor is really arbitrary. The intent is to get the sum of them all and the ratio, and with respect to the allocation factor for a particular component, get that ratio right. And John, you are 100% correct, and maybe my next example will show you how we can do that. So for example, approach number 2, where we base it on complexity and risk. Let's just say we've gone through a process of allocating complexity-based allocation factors to each subsystem and component. But we go back to our familiar, and this particular component here has a very severe consequence. In medical devices, for example, you typically will have one component whose failure is quite bad, where you might involve overdose or somehow mistreating the patient. So failure of this component has a very severe consequence, much more severe than others. And what we can do, for example, is introduce a consequence factor. And in this case, let's just say the most components with the most severe outcome will give a consequence factor of 2, and those with the least severe will give a consequence factor of 1. And in this case, we can simply multiply our complexity factors by these consequence factors to get these numbers here. So we've essentially doubled the allocation factor for this really critical component, and it's now 16. And this spring over here has a severity factor of 1.5, so it's new allocation factor of 6. So in this way, we can incorporate both risk and complexity. And John, as you can see here, it doesn't matter how high we go. It is entirely arbitrary because we simply find the ratio of one allocation factor with respect to the sum of all allocation factors. And so this is just one example of including complexity and risk. And the third approach is any way you want. Now, this is a bit of a cop-out, I know, but the point I'm trying to make here is that you must always remember that your first allocated goals are guides and guides only, because what's more important is this sequence over here, this cycle over here. Using those goals to understand what the state of your system is during the design process, and constantly reallocating reliability, constantly doing something about it. I'd be amazed if in a robust design process, allocated reliability goals stayed the same. So what can this look like? You can create your own combination of allocation factors based on any factor that matters to your system: importance, complexity, risk, state-of-the-art, technical readiness level, usage, and so on. And another approach is to use historical estimates of reliability for each component or subsystem. And this is what we call the Aeronautical Radio Incorporated, or ARINC approach. Another example is just simply equal allocation and apportionment, which is typically never good, but as I was speaking with Fred yesterday about, if you do this, you can at least spur conversation. If everyone gets the same reliability goal, you quickly realize which teams are going to struggle and which teams are not going to, so which teams will easily exceed the goal. And you should inspire communication, but before long, you won't have a need for equal apportionment. Another approach is what we call simple expert judgment, but this is really problematic because no matter what these experts come up with, you need to sort of modulate these reliability design goals to make sure the system reliability goal is met. So you may as well just go straight to allocation factors. Here is another approach. I think John, you were, not John, someone was talking about, sorry, Pascal was talking about the complexity of a subsystem being analogous to the number of components. This approach here is based on the advisory group on reliability of electronic equipment organization, who use that particular approach for these allocation factors, but their equation also includes this weighting factor, which means that if your system or product has a certain probability of failure if a particular component fails, then you can incorporate it here to influence your reliability design goals. Of course, if you have a simple series system, the weighting factor will always be 1, and so this collapses back to the equation we covered earlier. And so the final approach is a very sophisticated one, where instead of having just basic equations, we introduce this variable over here. This is the reliability improvement for the ith system if we have a particular design initiative. The idea is that we want to put a notional cost to this design improvement and then work out the total cost of reliability improvement for the entire system, and then optimize the cost with respect to reliability. This is a very sophisticated way of doing things, and in my experience, it requires a lot of information, more information than most organizations have, particularly if you're creating a developmental system. But if you've got a lot of COTS elements, if you know the prices of different componentry, and if you have confidence in the reliability estimates of each one, this can be a very useful way of optimizing cost with respect to reliability. But I must stress, you have to have a really, really high degree of certainty in your design process, and quite often we don't. So, approach number 3, any way you want. Here are some basic approaches for allocating reliability, because the main point is the system, not the goals. Any questions so far? Christy Amos asks, can we allocate reliability growth goals and many steps of development based on difficulty to demonstrate? I think reliability growth, it's almost its own separate topic, and typically reliability growth, at least in my experience, focuses on system level reliability growth testing, if you're talking about that formal approach. Sometimes you might want to have interim reliability goals for your system, so that after preliminary design, your estimated reliability is 5% below what your final reliability needs to be, to introduce some sort of glide path, and that's okay. The main point of what we're trying to do here is give your design team leader an understanding of where the reliability of the system is at all stages of design. Give design teams goals to strive for, and essentially everyone knows where they need to be, and everyone knows when they are not where they need to be, so you can do something about it. So, a question you guys might be asking is, how far down should I allocate? Should I allocate to PCB levels, assembly levels, or single suppliers? Well, if we go back to our example here where we had our 9 components and we've created a functional series system, you really should allocate as far down as makes sense. What do we mean by that? Well, we mean what makes sense from a human accountability perspective. So you don't want to have multiple teams working towards a single allocated goal. You want to have them allocated to different teams. This is why allocation is really, really useful. You don't want to have them spread across different disciplines. You don't necessarily want to have them so far down that one single person has 10 reliability goals they need to accommodate. Give them one goal, and if they want to allocate themselves internally, let them do that. So again, are there any more questions? I see from Kim. That's a question you want for the end of the talk. I'll respect that request. Keegan, is 5% below goal typical for interim goals, or some other common rule of thumb used? I have often seen that interim goals involving doubling the unreliability. So for example, if you want to have an end state of 95% reliability, so perhaps the interim goal is 90% reliability, where you double the unreliability from 5 to 10%. But again, I think that's the subject of another webinar too. And the main focus here is to make sure your design team lead knows if you're on track, and give those aspirational goals to your design team lead. Alejandro, if you know your loads, you have a feeling about your damage mechanisms, and it is linked with the real world, do you use it? Absolutely. You might recall that one key step of our cycle was system reliability modeling, so you can work out which are the vital few and so on and so forth. And very importantly for this conversation, we want our system reliability model to include all this information, so we have ongoing and accurate estimates of reliability at each stage of design and development. Pascal, do you use RBDs to calculate the allocation up or down? Absolutely. If RBDs work for you, you can use RBDs instead of fault trees. One of your design teams, for example, might work out that the best way to meet their reliability goal is to include redundancy. And so then that team then informs the design team lead, who updates the system reliability model. And because you have this process, because the design team lead gives the goal in the first place, and the individual design team, subordinate design team provides that feedback, you have really good lines of communication, which is perhaps one of the most important characteristics of reliability allocation. So, how much effort do I invest in getting the first allocations right? Well, that's a very broad question, and I'm going to answer it in perhaps in a cunning and devious way. The reality is you want your efforts for reliability allocation to be dwarfed by other more important steps of creating a reliable system, which primarily involves doing something. Allocating reliability doesn't improve reliability. Testing doesn't improve reliability. Improving the design of your system improves reliability. So we just need to be comfortable with the fact that our first goals are simply guides, which should be routinely updated as we learn more about our system through the design process. The worst thing that can happen is that you spend so much time trying to validate, verify initial reliability goals that you spend all your effort on allocating reliability instead of remembering that it should be a guide. So don't obsess over verifying and validating it endlessly. There's always uncertainty involved. So make your peace with that. These initial allocated goals are simply guides because of that uncertainty. And your organization typically only has a certain reliability engineering capacity. If you ask your team to spend days, weeks, or however long it takes to do a full physics of failure, very rigorous activity, which involves what you think is very high, what you think are very accurate allocated goals from the start, they may not want to come back to you ever again. They might think that that is all they need to do, especially if you made them put in a lot of effort. Understand your organization has a finite capacity to do reliability stuff, so don't waste it. And one of the best ways of not wasting it is remembering that your first allocated goals are simply guides, which you then update and improve and optimize as you go through the design process. And one of the things we're trying to avoid with reliability allocation is over-engineering. So we go back to our disposable battery example. Reliability allocation can help us work out if we are going to use a disposable battery versus a rechargeable battery. Disposable batteries in some cases are less reliable, but rechargeable battery involves more components and a separate charger. How can you know if you can use one versus the other? Well, you might be able to go to a rechargeable battery, or you might have to go to a rechargeable battery if you know that the rest of your product is struggling to meet the reliability goals. If that's the case, the decision's been made for you. So, but if the rest of your product is really comfortably meeting their allocated goals, then you might have scope to use disposable batteries. Fewer components, don't need to have a charger. Because the rest of your device is very, very reliable, then you can use a disposable battery. Again, you won't know unless you start with a reliability goal for each component or subsystem and then continually update that through the design process. And with that, I'll open the floor to any final questions. I see Pascal, Arink versus agree. Is one more effective than the other in your experience? I tend to prefer. Firstly, I prefer to use allocation factors based on a combination of factors that make sense to your organization, including complexity, risk, so on and so forth. Just as a refresher, Arink essentially replaces allocation factors with historical point estimates of reliability for each component. And the agree approach involves a weighting factor where you take into consideration how failure of a component might not guarantee system or product failure. Typically, when you're starting with a series system, the weighting factor is always 1. So I tend to prefer Arink and simple allocation factor approaches because your system reliability model should subsume all those weighting factors. Pascal asked, is it possible to allocate availability too? Absolutely, Pascal. You can. One of the good things about availability is you have more than one trigger to pull. You can improve availability by focusing on reliability or focusing on maintainability. So if you allocate availability when that's the thing that matters most to your organization, you're ensuring there's a lot of flexibility to your design teams. And if you stick to availability goals, you give your design teams the flexibility to consider maintainability as well, which can often be a really easy way of improving availability. I can see there's another couple of questions coming. And sorry, just going back to availability, the equations that we use for reliability are completely analogous to availability as well. So instead of having your reliability design goal, swap that out for availability, and the equations will be the same. You can see 2 questions coming, at least technology says. Pascal asks, if your system comprises both repairables and consumables, how do you allocate availability? Well, with repairables, obviously you're talking about a system or subsystem, that can be repaired. You don't throw it away. You go in and do something to it to bring it back to an operational state. With consumables, you don't repair it, but you do tend to have to replace them. So both repairables and consumables have similar approaches in terms of downtime. As opposed to repairing a consumable, you just simply swap it. So that that still means you can have an availability estimate for that consumable component or subsystem. So it shouldn't change how you allocate availability. If you have a design team who's focusing on a repairable subsystem, you can give them an availability goal. If you have a design team focusing on a consumable subsystem, they can still have an availability goal because it will still take a certain amount of time to replace that component. So there should be no modification required. David asked if it is assumed that every item that gets an allocation can be independently tested. Absolutely not assumed. That's a very good question, though, because there is a tendency for us to really think about, really focus on testing in terms of having that very, very sure sense of, are we on track or not? So one example I would use, David, is if we're using a product which is using a battery which was used in the previous model. We have good data about what that battery can do. We have good data about the failure mechanisms of that battery. We might not need to test that battery to understand its reliability characteristics. So that means we can still use the field data from the previous model, put it into our system reliability model, and work out if we're on track for the next generation of device or product, where the rest of the components are being designed from scratch. So I really like that question, David, because it really touches on a key point I'd like to emphasize. You only should be focusing on testing the vital few, the components that are going to fail more often than most. If you have good confidence in reliability through analysis, that's okay as well. And sometimes you have things like housing and plastic components, which you know from experience will be very, very reliable. Alessio, is it possible to use HALT tests for allocation? That too is a very good question. Now, HALT tests are not quantitative. They help us understand the prioritized list of dominant failure mechanisms, which is as useful a set of information as you can possibly have for a designer. So the limitation of HALT is that you can't then use that to estimate reliability for your system or components. But to be clear, HALT is one of my favorite DFR activities because the information you get from it is very, 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 very useful. But what you can do with your HALT outcomes or your HALT tests is identify those vital few we talked about, and then that's where you focus on your testing thereafter. Hopefully that answers your question, Alessio, and it's a really good one. Peter asked, how can the time dependence of reliability be factored? Different subsystems have different time dependencies, failure rate, so on. Okay, so that's an interesting question, Peter. I think you're talking about how things wear out, potentially have constant hazard rates. And I think that needs to come back to, if I understand the question correctly, that needs to come back to your understanding what your customer wants. So for example, if you're designing a product which is going to be used in a hospital, you might know that the industry expects that medical device to work for 7 years. That's just how often you understand the technological generational refresh of a hospital, how frequently those refreshes occur every 7 years. So that might be your service life, and you might have a service life reliability goal. You might have a separate warranty period of, let's just say 3 years. So from your business side of the house, you'll have a warranty reliability goal for your team. You might also want to impose a further reliability goal for those infant mortality or dead on arrival failures, because they cost a lot more in terms of brand damage. So you might want to have a third reliability goal that makes sure we get on top of our manufacturing processes. So for each one of these different goals, you should be requiring your design teams to model reliability for that entire period, which includes wherein constant hazard rates wear out. We should know these pretty well if we're always focusing on the vital few. So hopefully that answers your question, in that our reliability is the reliability at the end of a certain period of interest, warranty period, service life, or something different. Christiomo, we allocate at a level we can demonstrate during the development. I think that's a statement. Sometimes that's true, and especially for our very vital or high severity components. But I've seen certain cases where, again, if we're recycling components, or if it's a well understood technology, or a failure is not a huge issue, where analysis can work. And again, that's up to the judgment of the design team lead. But I think that's a good point you raise, Chrysostomo. Sorry, I think I'm mispronouncing your name. A good rule of thumb in terms of how far down we allocate is what part of our subsystem will we independently test. Arun asked, do you use any software packages to perform allocation? There are some software packages out there, but for me, I think the actual math is so simple, touch wood, that an Excel spreadsheet would suffice, and that's typically how I've done it in the past. Alessio asked, what is your opinion in using some reliability standards such as Siemens Telecordia to get a first insight into which components look the more critical? My general answer is use whatever information source you have at hand, including those standards, to try and understand what your likely dominant failure mechanisms should be. But they should be your fleeting first step, because as soon as you identify what these standards say should be your areas of concern, you then need to investigate further. So you'll very quickly confirm if those or you should very quickly confirm if they're relevant for your subsystem. See another question coming in. I might scroll back up to the question that was requested to be delayed till the end by Kim, where Kim asked if we're able to make the slides available for download or contact you later. I'll certainly talk to you, Kim, after this. I know Fred records this webinar, so if you do want to go through at any stage and have a look at some of the imagery, you should have access to that as well. But if you want to, I can reach out after this and we can talk further about what it is you might need. Any more questions? Circling back to HALT from another Chris. That's a very, very solid name. Couldn't you allocate a higher reliability goal to components that fail at higher stresses versus lower goals for components that fail at lower stresses? So I think you're talking about using HALT to work out which components you think will be the ones which will be more likely to fail. And I certainly agree with what you're getting at, Chris. That's a very valid point. And I'll say it back to you to make sure I understand your intent. You can correct me if I'm wrong. If you work out if one component fails at a higher stress, then you'd reasonably suspect it's more reliable than another component which fails at a lower stress. So using the ARINC approach, you could have a roughly align point estimates of reliability to your HALT tests in that way. In which case, I'd agree with you. If you want to incorporate those stress levels into your allocation factor, have at it. That's a very valid approach. So thank you for bringing me back to what your question was about HALT in the first place. Pascal, what is a common mistake you've seen made when reliability allocation is performed? That is so easy to answer, Pascal. The common mistake I see is too much effort is spent into getting the first set of allocated goals perfect. And the organization then forgets that these are guides which need to be constantly updated as the design becomes apparent. That's easily the most important mistake, it's the most common mistake I see in reliability allocations. And I think Fred is answering your question, Kim, about where the recording of the webinars can be found at Ascendo Reliability as well. Chrysostomo, is it a common practice allocating a low reliability to have a fuse in the system? How that fuse will be reliable as fuse? So let me try and understand the question. Is it common practice to allocate low reliabilities, and then by that we mean reliabilities which are easier, reliability goals which are easier to achieve, for those components to have a fuse in the system? I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, because fuses don't prevent failure, they prevent damage. So this is a very electronic or electric focused question. And I think that's a separate topic. However, there might be an underlying issue I'm missing. Planning to have a failure in the components is what is a few responses coming back from the crowd. I can see that I think Chris Estamo, you're talking about something that will fail more than others, and Pascal, correct, could be the canary in the mine, and that's a precursor of something more substantial happening. I'm not entirely sure I understand the question fully, and perhaps after this, Chris Estamo, if you want, you can email me separately, or you can continue the conversation. But yeah, fuses are typically used to prevent damage and sometimes injury, versus as opposed to preventing failure. They'll shut the system down more often if necessary, to make sure your system doesn't get damaged or people don't get hurt. So it's more about what technology or what energy source a component or subsystem is using as to whether you should have a fuse or not. And I see we have 3 more minutes in the allocated 1 hour window. So if there's any more questions, here we go. John, we do not do any reliability allocations at the moment. What are some arguments you've seen that finally get the light bulb to turn on for management executives that this is valuable? That's a very difficult question to answer. Sometimes, and I'll cite the conversation I had with Fred yesterday, where he introduced the concept of reliability allocation to a team, and he simply gave each team the same goal to meet the product's reliability requirement. And some teams were up in arms because that goal was so high, and other teams were wondering what the issue was, because those goals for their technology were really easy to achieve. And it just started a conversation. I think if I can paraphrase or relay Fred's observation correctly, what that meant is when the design team lead saw this behavior, this communication, this trading off, where one team said, yeah, it's easy for me to achieve, you can have some of mine. She saw the communication that this very arbitrary equal apportionment approach caused in the team. So the communication that happened thereafter was very, very valuable. But in terms of the design teams or the management understanding not jumping on board, I'd suggest perhaps they've had poor experiences, and perhaps reliability allocation has not been explained to them in the way it should. A lot of organizations think reliability allocation is done once up front. It's a huge endeavor, and then those goals are used to inform demonstration testing 2 or 3 years later. And that's a horrific approach. They need to be treated as guides, which get routinely updated, and perhaps educating your leadership that the reliability process or cycle I showed you is much more important than the goals might help. And we're back to talking about fuses from Alejandro. But John, hopefully that answered your question. Perhaps a better explanation to your leadership team that reliability allocation goals start as a guide, because the intent is to inform the cycle, work out which teams are struggling, inform trade-off. And sometimes it can inform opportunities, because if teams can say, hey, look, I can actually achieve higher reliability than the goal you allocated to me, for this cost or what have you, that then gives the design team lead flexibility in a way they know very well. They know a certain percentage increase in reliability for a power supply. They know what that means for the rest of the product, the rest of the system, the warranty period, or simply the ability to help out a struggling team. So John, sorry, I see that my description described your process, where those allocation is a huge endeavor up front and used to inform demonstration tests later on. That's not ideal. So if you can, and I'm happy to talk offline as well, if you can work with your management team to hopefully teach them or show them that it's a journey as opposed to a compass bearing at the start, hopefully that will help. And it's now rounding off to 12 o'clock. If there's any further questions, obviously, I think I'll listen to Fred's advice as well. I'll stay around for a little bit. You know our contact details through Ascendo. Thank you for your kind feedback that I can see there as well. If there's any further questions, including ones about failure rates and repairable systems, please feel free to reach out. It's great to talk to you all, and there's some really good probing questions. I can see that we have a really good bunch of reliability engineers online as well.